Well, last week we covered probably the hardest chapter or hardest passage in the Bible to hear, let alone preach, and we covered the crucifixion last week, and looked at what Jesus had to endure as he paid the ultimate price for us. And it wasn't even just the scourging and having nails driven into his wrists and his feet and hanging on a cross and dying. It was the spiritual abandonment or temporary abandonment anyway of the Father to the Son that he had to have dreaded. Something I was discussing last week, that there's nothing that anybody can really depict on a movie screen. You can get the gruesomeness of the blood and the tissues and all of that stuff, but you can't portray what it meant. For somebody that's never had to deal with separation from somebody that had his father, who he had the most ultimate, intimate relationship with. Think about the person you're closest to in this life, and it doesn't even come close to how intimate the Father is with the Son, and that was Father forsook him. And so as we went through that, it's gut-wrenching, but it's good to be reminded of the sacrifice that he made, and then we had communion, which just topped it all off. As we continue on, we're going to see how the Father, again, watches over his word to fulfill yet another prophecy. And to start us off, as we go into tonight, what we're going to discuss, some may look at it and go, well, why aren't you covering both the burial and the resurrection? And then that's just a decision I made. I pray that it was the Lord leading me to make it, but it's interesting as we look at these things, especially coming out of the crucifixion. It's important for us, as Steve was alluding to earlier at the offering, to not just know what we believe, but why we believe it, and that we don't have to just base it on blind faith. We don't just have to say, well, I read it in this book, and I get a good feeling about that. That just doesn't fly today. It shouldn't fly. It is where people get this idea of, well, I found my truth and this works for me. But it's either the truth or it's not. And we don't have to read this and go, man, I really hope. We can have certainty. And I realize it's a circular argument, but any religion is going to have some sort of circular argument in convincing somebody that what they believe is really true. And the Bible says that is true. It says that God is truth. In Numbers 23:19, it says, God is not man that he should lie, so he's not a liar, which means if he wrote the book, then none of it is lies, all of it's truth, right? So God is not man that he should lie, nor or a son of man that he should change his mind. Other translations say that he should repent. He's done nothing that he should be able to ask forgiveness for, because he's done nothing wrong. Has he said, and will he not do it? In other words, he's a God of his word. Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? And so we should be able to read Scripture with that truth alone and know that the God that authored it can be trusted. He doesn't lie. He's not sinfully flawed like us. And he's going to do what he says he's going to do. In Isaiah 55, verses 8 through 13, it says this, For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways or your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. That in and of itself should humble us. Oh, I've got a really great idea. Dude, here and heaven. That's a huge chasm. I'll keep reading. For as the rain and snow come down from heaven and do not return there but water the earth, in other words, that it fulfills its purpose, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. For you shall go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall break forth into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. My neighbor's cottonwoods drive me nuts, but it never occurred to me until the other day that they're just clapping their hands. They're just praising the Lord. Still don't like them. The leaves fall in my yard. Anyway, instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress. Instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle. And it shall make a name for the Lord, an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. So God is a God of His word. He will not lie, cannot lie. He is God and there is no other. That means there's no other options of anybody of God's status. Nor does the Bible teach that we can become gods. There's even Christian circles today that are twisting certain verses to say, but we're going to be little gods. Anyway, don't need to get off on that tangent. We can trust and know that whatever we read in here, if we read a promise, and we do need to be able to discern which promises are for us and which promises were for Israel and certain individuals, but ultimately, if He says it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And I just wanted that context as we go into tonight to be able to understand and grasp that what He's laying out here, we can take confidence in, okay? So as we look at these few verses today, like I said, they may seem like some minor details in the larger story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, but the bottom line is that if these details weren't recorded as truth for Scripture and of history, because they're both, it's not just somebody wrote this and nobody else could ever attest that it happened, because multiple historians recorded that Jesus really existed. He lived on this earth. They recorded what He did. They recorded that He was buried, and even was reported that He resurrected. I'm getting into next week's sermon. I should stop that. Okay, this is, again, it's not blind faith. We can look at historians and realize that He really existed. And so if He really existed, then we all have to decide what we're going to do with this person. Because either He is who He claimed to be, or He's a lunatic. Right? So I choose to believe that He is who He says He is. Matthew 27, verse 57. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who also was a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him, and Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the tomb. Now, compared to what we just experienced last week in the crucifixion, this almost seems, I don't know, like a transition to the next really big part, right? Which it kind of is, but there's some very important details that are here that I think that we should pay attention to. So initially, in a lot of crucifixions, because Jesus wasn't the only one ever crucified, right? Thousands and thousands of people were crucified in the years that Rome used crucifixion as a way to kill and torture and kill thousands and thousands of people. But the customary process was to leave the bodies on the cross and let the animals eat them. So this is out of the ordinary. There's occasion where, people would request the body, and the Jews, of course, did not want the body to be hung there, any bodies to be hung there outside the city of Jerusalem on the Passover season. So they didn't want it there either. And the Romans did grant corpses of executed men to friends and relatives, for proper burial from time to time. This statement that it was evening is important. As you remember, the crucifixion happened on what we know as Good Friday. That was Passover. And if you remember, the Jewish day started at sundown and ended at the 24 hours later at sundown. That was their day. If you read Genesis, each creation account, it says, and there was evening and there was morning, one day. So that's how they look at it. And I would go back to Genesis. If you're struggling to grasp a 6-day creation, read that in light of the Jewish culture, and you'll see more of how I believe it is 6 days, 6 actual days. God doesn't need millions of years. Different sermon. So this detail is important because he was crucified on Passover, and so the fact that it was evening, that means that at sundown the Sabbath was going to start. Okay, Shabbat is what is the Hebrew word for it, and so because that was starting, they had to get him off the cross, wrapped up, coated in whatever herbs, spices, embalmed basically, and in the ground with a stone rolled in front before sundown, because it would have been unlawful for them to do such on the Sabbath. So it's very important. That little detail is, we don't need to ignore that or just brush over it like it's nothing. This made the day Jesus died the day of preparation. The day before Sabbath is the day of preparation. They're preparing for the Sabbath. Okay? John records a few more details of who all was involved in this, because it mentions, Joseph of Arimathea in Matthew, but it also brings in somebody else that we've heard of before. It says, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, which Matthew mentioned, but it says, but secretly for fear of the Jews, which is interesting, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus, remember him from John 3, you must be born again, and there's that whole, do I have to re-enter my mother's womb argument that Nicodemus had with Jesus. So Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. So here's the thing, and the reason that I even think that these prominent men being mentioned is of huge significance is because of their prominence and the fact that if they were willing, first of all, to step forward and ask for the body, that's a public thing. It's not like they could sneak into Pilate and have a private word where nobody else would hear it. And besides that, it says that Jesus was placed in Joseph of Arimathea's new tomb. If he's prominent, he was part of the Sanhedrin, okay? So people would have known who he was. They would have known where his tomb was. And so if it had been vacated, people would have known. So all of these things bleed into it. Both of these gentlemen seem to be secret disciples of Jesus for fear of repercussions of their association with him. But God raised up 2 previous secret disciples, these 2, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, to receive the body of Jesus and to give it the best burial they could in the short time that they had to prepare before sundown for the start of the Sabbath. Joseph didn't serve Jesus in many ways, but he did serve him in ways no one else could. No one else had the money that was part of his disciples to give him this brand new grave. And you and I think of a grave, what do you think of? You think of a 6-foot deep hole. And we can tell from the text that it's not a hole in the ground, it's a hole inside of a rock mountain or a hill, and it was carved into this rock. That is not the grave of a poor person. That is a grave of a rich person. The tradition was to go ahead and bury them, roll the stone, because they're going to stink for a little while as they decay. And then once it's just bones, and they would go back, kind of wrap up the bones, put them in the back for the next, make room for the next person to be buried. But we don't have to worry about, that with Jesus, because he only needed the tomb for a few days. The fact that Joseph's tomb was being used for Jesus' body also fulfills prophecy. Isaiah 53:9 says, "They made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth." In the hours of crisis, it is often the Peters who have sworn loyalty to Jesus with big gestures of fullness of self-confidence that disappoint. And it is the secret and quiet followers of the Master, like Joseph and Nicodemus and the women, that do not hesitate to serve him in love at whatever cost. That was Geldenhuys. I think that's how you say his name anyway. He's a theologian. This new tomb, Spurgeon says this about his tomb. He said it was a new tomb wherein no remains had been previously laid, and thus if he came forth from it, there would be no suspicion that another had risen. Nor could it be imagined that he rose from through touching some old prophet's bones, as he did who laid in Elisha's grave. If you remember Elisha's grave being there, and they touched his bones and they came back to life. This idea of the myrrh and the aloes, these were embalming herbs and treatments. They were to help embalm and stop the stink. But this idea that it's about 75 pounds, if it sounds excessive, it is. But it's not because Joseph didn't know how to buy the right quantities. It was a demonstration of a wealthy person to show and express his devotion. And it required the entire body to be wrapped and the whole thing to be anointed and smeared with it. David Guzik says this was the customary way to seal an expensive tomb, talking about the rock being rolled across it. A rich man like Joseph of Arimathea probably had a tomb carved into solid rock. This tomb was in a garden near the place of crucifixion. And that's why the prophecy in Isaiah is true about this tomb, because in John 19:41, it says, "Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid." So Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was in close proximity to the place where they crucified everyone. And so it's amazing to me, as Steve was referring, the reason that we're studying Isaiah on Monday mornings is because we need to know the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament points to the New Testament. And the New Testament points back to the Old Testament. So it all works. We don't have to fear that there's going to be some sort of contradiction that we might be surprised by. Okay? The tomb would commonly have a small entrance, and I alluded to this earlier, and perhaps one or more compartments where bodies were laid out after being somewhat mummified with spices, ointments, and linen strips. Customarily, the Jews left these bones. I read all that already. Let's skip on to the next one. There is a simple fact in these verses that we don't need to miss, though. Anyone who lived in these times, having read these words about the two very prominent men asking for the body of Jesus from the Roman governor and then burying them in Joseph's tomb, would have been completely discredited if it had been false. Because everybody knew who the prominent men were. And if he really hadn't been buried where they said he was buried and all this stuff, then it would have come out really quickly. Every Jerusalem Jew would have known who Joseph of Arimathea was. It would have been all too easy to verify or deny the accuracy of the claim that he gave his tomb to be used for Jesus' body. And ultimately, it would have been even more easy to see that tomb that was claimed to be emptied as Joseph's tomb as well. Verse 61 almost seems, again, almost insignificant. If you look back at it, I don't know if you can pull that up there, but verse 61, it says, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting opposite the tomb. So what? Well, here's so what. The so what is the fact that these same women were the ones that were there on his resurrection. So it wouldn't have been near as impactful to have the Marys there on Friday night and then the disciples first there on Sunday morning. The people that watched him go into the tomb witnessed that very tomb empty. It's not like they walked up to the wrong tomb. They had been there. They knew what it was. They watched them load Jesus' body into the tomb. They came back expecting him to be dead, and I'm getting into next week's sermon. So they knew what they were doing, right? Maybe I should have put them together. Anyway. The reason that these women are mentioned is because it gave eyewitnesses. It named the witnesses. And they witnessed them put him in there, and they will witness him come out as well. So Matthew 27, verse 62 says, the next day, that is the day after preparation, and that would be the Sabbath, the Shabbat, the chief priests who should have been recognizing the laws of Shabbat, and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, Sir, we remember how that impostor said while he was still alive, after 3 days I will rise. Therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he is risen from the dead. And the last fraud will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, You have a guard of soldiers? Go make it as secure as you can. So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. There's a lot of details I'm going to cover here in this section, mainly history and method, but it's all important, and it all should lend to encourage us that Jesus really died, he was really buried, it was sealed, and he was resurrected, even based off of some of these details, okay? So Barclay says this, it must mean that the chief priests and Pharisees actually approached Pilate on the Sabbath with a request. If they did that, it is clear to see how radically they broke the Sabbath law. Verse 63, we read two things, two statements of the chief priests and Pharisees that we should agree that give fact to Jesus' death. So, and it debunks the swoon theory. We'll get to the swoon theory in just a second. We also see that these enemies of Jesus recalled his words saying that he would come back from the dead, even when his disciples didn't remember that. They all ran and scattered for fear of what might happen to them. But even the Pharisees remembered of what he said. The swoon theory, if you're wondering about that, was an argument that denied the resurrection, saying that Jesus never really died, but just swooned on the cross. And then somehow he was wonderfully revived in the tomb, which is interesting. As I was studying for this and reading some different articles, there was a humorous little exchange that was recorded on the swoon theory. It's from a Christian magazine, and the person writes in, it says, Dear Eutychus. I guess Eutychus is like the Bible answer man or something. But it says, Dear Eutychus, our preacher said on Easter that Jesus just swooned on the cross, and that the disciples nursed him back to health. What do you think? Sincerely bewildered. Eutychus writes this back. He says, Dear bewildered, beat your preacher with a cat of nine tails with 39 heavy strokes, nail him to a cross, hang him in the sun for 6 hours, run a spear through his heart, embalm him, put him in an airless tomb for 36 hours, and see what happens. Sincerely, Eutychus. The chief priests and Pharisees said he was dead. They knew when you run, and I didn't cover this last week, but when he was pierced in the side with a spear, what came out? If he had still been alive, it would have been blood. But the blood had separated into water and blood clots, basically. And that flowed out. That is a sign of death. Any hunter knows that. Right? So all the signs were there. The people that want to discredit him just don't believe, and they want to do whatever they can to prove that. So this is the question that was probably they were up against as they thought about accusing the disciples of stealing him. It would have been so easy to just, hey, where's the body? You say he rose again. They would have to produce a body. It's not like they're going to parade him through the streets, making it look like he's alive. I mean, have you seen Weekend at Bernie's? I mean, it's a silly example, but seriously, I'm watching the movie going, who really believes that this guy is alive? My point is, it could have easily been discredited, debunked, one way or the other. If they stole the body, okay, where's the body? Or produce the real Jesus. You're saying he rose again. But the simple fact is, and we'll look at this next week, is there were hundreds of witnesses to seeing Jesus in person, in the flesh. They put their fingers, they could see the wounds in his wrists and in his feet. He walked with them, he talked with them, he ate with them. France says this about Justin. I'm curious who Justin is. I guess it's in Dialogues 108. But it says, Justin says that such stories were still being actively disseminated in the middle of the 2nd century. The fact that such propaganda in itself indicates that it could not be denied that the tomb was empty. What was questioned was how it came to be empty. Jewish leaders and the Romans were well aware of the need to guard the tomb, and that the fact that they took all necessary measures to secure it proves that. These security measures simply gave greater testimony to the miracle of the resurrection. If Jesus' tomb was unguarded, one might suggest that an unknown person or persons stole the body, and it would be difficult to refute that. Yet because the tomb was well guarded, we can be certain that his body wasn't stolen. Sealing the stone and setting the guard, which was described in this passage, it describes the measures taken to secure the tomb of Jesus. And there were 3 obstacles that were put into place. The first one is the material obstacle. The tomb was secured by a stone. These stones were large and set in inclined channels, so it's not like it's on a level ground. They would have to roll it up. So gravity made it sit in its place, and it wasn't being moved, not easily. This was a real obstacle. For sure, the stone could not be rolled away from the inside. The disciples, if you had enough of them, could have rolled it away, but not quietly. Besides, they would have had to work together in rolling it away, and they weren't really doing that at the time. The tomb was secured by a seal, which was an obstacle of human authority. The seal, picture, if you've ever seen the movie Risen, it gives a really good depiction of how they sealed the tomb. There was a rope that went from one side of the stone to the other, and it had globs of wax on each side that would seal the tomb. Now, did it keep it shut? No, but it would be able to tell you if the seal had been broken, if somebody had messed with it, right? You could not move the rock without breaking the seal. It was important that the guards witnessed the sealing because they were responsible for whatever was being sealed. These Roman guards would watch carefully as the stone was sealed because they knew that their careers and perhaps their lives were on the line. The Roman seal carried legal authority. It was more than yellow tape barricading a modern crime scene. To break a Roman seal was to defy the Roman authority. That stone was secured by the authority of the Roman Empire. So the tomb was secured by a guard as well, which was an obstacle of human strength. A typical Roman guard was 4 soldiers. 2 watched while others rested. This guard may have had more than 4 soldiers. The soldiers were fully equipped: sword, shield, spear, dagger, and armor. We should also remember that these were Roman soldiers, so these weren't, some militia that was put together. They didn't care about Jesus or the Jewish laws or rituals. All they cared was to secure the tomb of the criminal. And to them, the only sacred thing on that tomb was the seal itself, the seal of Rome. Because if that were broken, their careers were ruined, and they might even be executed because of it. Soldiers cold-blooded enough to gamble over a dying man's clothes were not the kind of men to be tricked by trembling disciples, or would not jeopardize their necks for sleeping at their posts. And that's going to be important for next week. None of these obstacles mattered. They will all fall away before him, because none of it stood a chance against the resurrection power of Jesus Christ. Poole says this: vain men, as if the same power that was necessary to raise and quicken the dead could not also remove the stone and break through the watch they had set. But by their excessive care and diligence, instead of preventing Christ's resurrection as they intended, they have confirmed the truth and belief that and sent that message all around the world. For every believer, Jesus' death and burial isn't just important. We identify with him in his death when we choose to be baptized. And I wrote this last week, and Sunday we baptized 17 folks down at 9 Mile Creek. And that's not to pat anybody on the back but the Lord. Because it's the Lord that worked in their lives, drew them to him, and offered them the gift of salvation. They were just the obedient ones that said, okay, I'll be baptized. Baptism is a physical demonstration of what happens spiritually when we receive Christ. We identify with him in his death. Romans 10, 9 through 10, and I'm going to read this because I never want to assume that everybody that's gathered here knows the Lord and is saved. And sometimes, as Joanna was mentioning before worship, we feel like we have to get our lives cleaned up. I need to stop smoking, I need to stop drinking, I need to stop cussing, a whole list of things that I need to get right so that God won't zap me when I come to him to say, will you save me? Whether it's easy to rationalize or not, it's where our mind goes, because we realize our sinfulness. We realize how far the chasm is between his holiness and our sinfulness. And that chasm, if we let it stay there, will be the thing that holds us back if we think we've got to get good enough before we can come to him. I just want to read these 2 verses and reveal to anyone in the room that might be on the verge of accepting Christ, to just show you how simple it is. It says, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. Why is it that we identify with him in baptism? Why is it going under the water is a symbol? When Joanna talks to little children about baptism, she said, it's like this. This ring that I wear, does this make me married? No, it's just a symbol to go, I'm taken, I'm married. There's a lot of different forms of that these days, tattoos and all sorts of things. But that's a symbol that I'm married. Me not having it on doesn't make me any less married, but it is a message to anyone that sees me, I'm taken. I'm committed to my wife. I'm married. So when we're baptized, when we stand in front of either a few people or a bunch of people and say, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and I confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and I believe that God raised him from the dead, and now I'm going to identify physically as a sign to all of you of what I believe. You go under the water, and we are identified with him in his death, but raised to new life. Romans 6, 3 through 4, and I'll end with this. Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? We were buried, therefore, with him into baptism, into death, in order that, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. The truth there to grasp first is God offers us salvation. And we identify with Him in His death, but don't miss the last part, that we too might walk in newness of life. He did not come into this world to leave us where He found us, wretched sinners. If He had found me and said, you just keep looking at porn, keep ruining your marriage, would He love me anyway? Absolutely. But does He want me to stay there? No. He wants me to get rid of the sin in my life with His help to honor Him. I remember having a sticker on my computer that said, don't cuss. And it was hard because I cussed like a sailor. And I had 160 sales reps that would call me all throughout the day, wanting to tell me dirty jokes, send me pornography, and want me to just join right in there with them. But I put a sticker on there because I need a reminder that I don't need to do that. It doesn't bring God glory. Besides that, what comes out of our mouths is what's in our hearts. Philippians 2, I ended on this. You thought I was ending. Romans 6. Gotcha. Philippians 2, I think gives us some encouragement, and I will end with this. It says in verse 12, it's not up there because I failed to get it to anybody. Yeah. It says, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Now, if we just stop there, it'd be like, oh, man, I got to work out my salvation with fear and trembling. That word work could also be translated walk. Walk out your salvation with fear and trembling. Fear in the Lord. Trembling going, I don't want to. It's not that I better not because He's going to get me. It's I don't want to disappoint Him. I don't want to fail Him. But here's the encouragement, verse 13. For it is God who works in you. I've said this time and time again. I'm going to say it again. I'm going to keep reminding us because we tend to think it's in our own strength. We tend to think that it's all up to us. We got to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and do our best. God says it's me that works in you, both to will and to work for my good pleasure. Because this whole life is not about you. Shocker. It's not about me either, by the way. I realize that. It's about God. It's about His glory. It's about giving Him that glory. And we give Him that glory as we worship Him with our lives, living in newness of life. Let's pray.